LA that you'll come by, but I hope that you'll visit us again and again through this platform and other different vehicles. Someone just asked if we used to be the University of Judaism. We used to be the University of Judaism 10 years ago. So we're glad you're back. And now you'll know us as the American Jewish University. So with that, I would love to get started. Grief and loss for this time, what it looks like now. Tonight, I am joined by two panelists who not only have professional experience, but a very personal story to share with you all about grief and loss. And as morbid as it sounds, and I hopefully by the end of this evening, we won't think it's morbid at all, talking about grief and loss and how we integrate it into our life is probably one of my most privileged spaces to talk about as a rabbi, and I'm especially privileged to do that with you, Gabrielle, and you, Kate. Gabrielle Birkner is a Los Angeles-based journalist and the co-founder of Modern Loss. She served previously as the managing editor of JTA and a digital director of The Forward. She is the co-author of Modern Loss, Candid Conversations About Grief, and if you have not read it, immediately following this webinar, go online and get it. It will change your life. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vice, The Cut, and many other publications. She's nationally known on topics for young adult grief, Jewish mourning rituals, and building online communities. Gabby's been a featured speaker at the LA Times Festival of Books, Amazon HQ, The Wing, and the Miami Book Fair. And on a personal note, Gabby and I both went to Northwestern, and so we are both Wildcats. But I have been privileged so many times to learn from Gabby and to benefit from her wisdom. And so I'm delighted you're here, Gabby, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Kate Atwood, who I've known for much less time, but comes with an equally dynamic resume. 17 years ago, Kate founded Kate's Club, a nonprofit organization in Atlanta, Georgia, that serves bereaved children and teens and their families. Having lost her mother as a child, Kate started Kate's Club to introduce a new approach for youth facing grief, one centered around connection and growth. Kate is a frequent speaker, subject matter expert, and the author of A Healing Place, Help Your Child Find Hope and Happiness After the Death of a Loved One, again, a must-read, published by Penguin Books. Most recently, Kate launched Let's Talk About Loss, conversations for adults, corporations, and community groups looking to expand their understanding of loss and grief as it impacts us individually and collectively throughout life. I'm so delighted that you're here, Kate, and I'm so glad that you're going to give us a new window into grief and loss in this time when we are not only suffering individually, but as a community and as a world as whole. So thank you.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So as both of you know, grief and loss is a little bit of a taboo topic. It's like sex, money, and God. And of course, at AJU, we like to talk about those taboo topics, and we're not afraid. But I think at this moment in time, grief typically is experienced as something very personal and individualized, and we are comforted by the people we love. And yet in this pandemic, we're experiencing a national, an international, a communal set of grief. So first, tell us why you're both qualified to speak about grief, and then tell us a little bit about the difference between the grief we experience personally and the grief and loss that we're experiencing. Yeah, Gabby, let me start with you.
Sure. So I don't know, qualified, I'm not sure, but qualified certainly from personal experience. When I was 24 in 2004, my father and stepmother were murdered during a home invasion in their home in Sedona, Arizona. The perpetrator was a man who was addicted to methamphetamine, who had been sent a few weeks earlier to their house by a local plumbing company. This was an incredibly shocking, isolating, traumatizing experience for me, really separated my life into that before and after, which I think a lot of people, perhaps listening today, can understand what life felt like before the pandemic and what it feels like now. That really feels very stark. A few years on, a close friend of mine, Rebecca Sofer, who had worked in political comedy and I'd worked in journalism, we came together to create the platform Modern Loss, which is an online community about grief and loss where people can share their stories about having lost someone they love or someone they had a complicated relationship with. It also has a really strong backbone of resources. And it was a moment of Rebecca and I, as young adults, having both lost parents suddenly and tragically, not finding the resources we wanted to see out in the world, and asking ourselves, can we create them?
Beautiful. And I've benefited from it so much. And it's modernloss.com, right?
That's right.
Because I know a lot of people are already asking. And Kate, tell me a little bit about, you also had a personal experience that brought you to develop Kate's
Club. Yeah. So my story really starts when I was 12 years old, and my mother, Audrey, passed away. And, growing up as a child, there are things that are fundamental in your life that you never think will go away. And your mother is one of them. So it immediately thrusted me and my entire family on a journey that we were not prepared for. And I think growing up, I had a very kind of keen eye on, not only that you can't be prepared for loss and grief, but that we also live in a culture that really doesn't have the support systems around it. And as I got older and my world got bigger, I walked many years of my adolescence thinking that I was the only person whose mom had died. I mean, sometimes I joke, but it's kind of like Cinderella and Snow White. There was no modeling for me. There were no programs for me or for my family. And as I got older, I started to, obviously the world got bigger, and I started to realize this happens a lot. And we continue to just try to avoid that this is something that is life-changing and life transforming. And with Kate's Club, what I wanted to do, and I kind of joke, I was 22 years old and, wanted to change the world. Little did I know that really how big of a mountain I was having to climb to change the culture around grief. But Kate's Club is really about centering loss and grief in a positive way. And I think that is important. To reframe grief in our culture is critical, because we now live in a time where intergenerational grief and loss that has been avoided for decades, we're starting to see the dangers of those outcomes. And with kids, we have a really unique opportunity with their innocence to intercept their grief experience and have them grow up without the shame, and with community and with growth a part of it. And that's really the magic of Kate's Club. And Kate's Club now is 17 years old, which is pretty phenomenal, but it's still a pretty, unique service. There aren't enough of those communities, if you will. And so I've been a fan of Modern Loss, since they started theirs. I think we have a lot of work to do in understanding grief and how it affects us all, and how it's a wonderful thing to go through if you can understand the growth and the gifts that can come from it.
So first of all, thank you both for the work that you've done. And I'm so excited to hear you speak about grief. What I do want to say is that automatically grief goes to death. And both of your experiences were prompted by a death, but I know that that's sort of the beginning. There's loss, there's grief, and those aren't always accompanied by a death. Can you speak to what's the difference between loss and grief? And what are all the kinds of losses we may be experiences that may be connected to a death, but may not be connected to a death? I know personally, I feel a lot of loss, and gratefully, I don't have anyone that's died recently in my life. So maybe Kate, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So, to me, loss is the event and grief is the experience. And, the roots of grief and therapies around it and programs around it is around death and dying. I mean, Susan Keebler-Ross, who's probably one of the most well-known kind of experts, she built the methodology around the 5 stages. I mean, her studies were rooted in people who were dying. And what I think has happened as we've evolved over the decades and the generations is that we understand grief to be an experience that, for the living. And so, as I know Gabby likes to talk about, is loss is really the event of which separates the before and the after. And grief is that emotional experience that follows the after. And it is an emotional experience. And you're right that grief is more than just death-related loss. And I think we're in a moment of time where we're finally opening our minds and our hearts to accept that grief, we have a reaction to change of behavior and change of patterns when we lose such things as connection to each other, job, financial security, all these things that really feel kind of uprooted and a bit, disorienting right now. We're finally kind of saying, okay, this discomfort is grief. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity.
So are we all grieving right now?
Yes.
Like, can we just name that we're all grieving and that this is like the world is in mourning? And can you explain that?
And I, oddly, from a very unique perspective, have been waiting for this declaration for a long time. Grief and loss has been a part of the human experience since the beginning. Loss surrounds us, and a lot of times loss surrounds us, in our daily lives. But because we now live in a culture that really keeps us active and keeps us going, it's much easier to kind of skirt around, to kind of try to go over or maybe avoid some of what you would call the losses that, were a little bit more acute or, didn't necessarily have the intensity of, say, a death-related loss or a loss of relationship. But the difference is now that we're all feeling loss, all of us, universally, and we are stuck sitting with it. That's the biggest difference. It's not that grief and loss have changed. It's that not only are we experiencing loss, but we are in our homes. We can't do around it. We can't go and keep ourselves busy. And I think that should be recognized and that should be called out, because that is why we feel it so with such intensity, both our own unique losses and collectively.
So first of all, I want to go deep into that. For a moment, we've lost Gabrielle. She will be coming back in. For those of you that are just joining us, we're at Biyachad Together, spirited by American Jewish University. I'm with Kate Atwood, and Gabrielle Birkner of Modern Loss will be joining us in a second. I think you touched upon something so key in that we're sitting in our loss without the regular tools to help us get through or to integrate that loss. For Jews, we have this whole tradition of Shiva, and people come and visit us and they bring us food. I mean, you don't do grief alone. And yet we're stuck alone in our homes with the loss of dreams, the loss of ideas, the loss of economic, financial security. I mean, I could make a list. So what do you say to the person? How do you find some comfort around dealing with those losses on a daily basis? Because I know for me, they can make you pretty depressed.
Yeah, and they can be very disorienting because it's also about loss of, routine or loss of pattern, right? Those things that bring you comfort in your everyday, you now don't necessarily have control in those just being there, right? And we're all coming from different, kind of points of entry with that loss. And I say that because as much as we can talk about grief being universal right now, grief was, and always will be a unique experience. Even if the same relationship is lost because one person died, even if, there is a collective loss of ritual that we can't, have ceremony around death, whatever that may be, the grief that all of us are experiencing are very unique. And so it takes kind of the two-prong approach. And this is where I get excited, because it does take the self-care. It does take you giving yourself permission to grieve. And it does still take connection. And that connection is changed, right? That connection isn't the given of being able to go meet somebody for coffee, or being able to have, the rites and the funerals, all of that stuff with it. So I think it's important that now we're kind of sitting with this grief, and we're trying to understand that balance of self-care, but then also the community and the connection that it uniquely requires to be able to move forward with it.
I think that's also very telling, because we have this illusion of connection through the Zoom, but it's still different than that touch of a hand, than that presence that you feel when you're really grieving. What do you think specifically society is in mourning right now that we share?
I think the loss of the world that we knew it. That we knew, whether that was the fact that we took for granted the security of being able to go to the grocery store and not have to wear a mask. All of that stuff is, suddenly in our minds. It's suddenly at the surface, when before we just had a way of life. And that's again what Gabby really talks about, is like there will be a before and an after. And I think the biggest kind of crack in that, in all of us collectively, is that will be felt in what our patterns and behaviors were before this crisis and before this pandemic, and the patterns and behaviors that will arrive after.
So you talk about the before and the after, which I really love that, because I know for me, there was the life with my parents, then they died when I was young, and there's the after, the life without them. Right now I feel like we're in the middle. Right? We don't know what the after looks like. And sometimes being in the space of unknown, in Judaism, we have a term called the onen. It's the space between when someone dies and the space between when they're buried. It's a space in which you're not obligated to do anything, because it's so precarious. So I feel like right now we're in a state of aninut. We're in this transition state, and it's very uncomfortable. People talk about they don't even know what day it is, right? There's a disorientation and a fragmentation. What can you advise people in this moment to do for themselves and for each other that helps them sort of navigate the unknown and maybe feel more in control, or know that this isn't permanent?
So 2 points to answer that. The first is, it's going to feel counterintuitive, but we have to be easier on ourselves. We have to be softer on ourselves, that it's okay to not know, right? It's okay if you have days where you aren't productive, where you don't get through a checklist, where you just are. And I bring that up because I think that
is it okay to yell at your kids? Because I already did that a few times. Confession, right? Is it okay to just have said, I want off the roller coaster?
I believe it's about having grace about all of that. But I do think it is a time to really, be present. And I think that is, again, a challenge in our kind of American daily lives. And the reason I say it's important to be present is because the act of moving forward with your grief is going to require an act of letting go. And I don't necessarily mean the memories or the person or, what existed before. It is letting go of the grasp that we try to hold on to of certainty, right? Even if that certainty is shame, sadness, anger, what we do is we try to grasp that because we feel more safe around that than letting go and being in the freedom of uncertainty. And that is a very powerful kind of, move forward when you start to talk about, growing through your grief and facing your grief. And I would say that also is when it becomes really important to have community and connection around it, because uncertainty is a very scary thing. And giving yourself permission to be present in the discomfort and then to work to let go and to be okay in the uncertainty is really what I would love to see happen across all the, all the spectrums of loss and grief right now. I think you're muted. There we go.
Sorry about that. I was muted unexpectedly and trying to get Gabrielle Birkner back on. I got muted. Again, we're at American Jewish University. You've named something that I really want to drill down on, which is that there's a loss of security and that loss of certainty. And I think most of the time we don't think about that. We walk around feeling like we own the world, we're secure, and only in very private moments when we have our own devastating loss or personal loss do we think about those questions. But now we've joined this club with the whole world. And so uncertainty, insecurity, feeling unsafe, those are pretty big things. And I feel like some people who've gone through loss know how to do it better than others. Any tips that you would give us? Welcome back, Gabri. We're happy to see you. Any tips you would give us, Kate, to how to navigate living with that? You talked about being present. Is there something we can do in that presence for ourselves and for others?
Yes. So there's the first thing I would say, which is probably going to be, I like to say it for those who do have young people around them. And that is to actually observe these young people right now, observe these children, because first of all, they are grieving too. But they are doing it coming out of this, kind of maybe a puncture of innocence. And so how they grieve is a really beautiful kind of organic, thing to witness. And we as adults may be questioning their behavior or, their sadness or their acting out or their imagination. But all of that for adults is really, really healthy to see, because what they're going through is understanding that change, and they're trying to organically, kind of move through that by being present, but also without the stigma and the shame and the crust and a lot of the stuff that we adults have who have been through more of kind of, real world adapting to the realities, And so I offer that as just a simple exercise to do. Sometimes we try to say, oh, the kids, there's no way they have the emotional capacity to understand what's going on. Well, they feel it. They are grieving, and they're actually, their expression and their connection is a very organic, pure thing to witness right now. So that's a little side note. And I can also offer some advice on how to, really help children move through that. But then very, tangibly, an exercise that I often suggest is, we do a lot of gratitude lists. That's something that's really popular in kind of the self-care world. And I think while that is great, I think another list to make when you are sitting in your discomfort is to make a list of the things that you have lost. And just own that, just call it out, all of the things that you feel that you have lost in this time. And by the way, that may have been something that you lost a year ago and suddenly you're now triggered around it. And then next to that list, you're gonna write the things that have not changed, right? The things that remain the same. And what that does is it does two things. One, it brings awareness to your losses. And if we want to begin to move forward, then we have to give ourselves permission and be aware exactly of calling it out, right? And then also it helps to start to let those things go. So as you start to build that list, you start to see that the things that stay the same starts to grow. And then also you start to build a list of, oh, and these are the new things that are coming into my life. These are the new openings. These are the new patterns. I'm, exercising more. I've met new people. I've done more learning, right? And so it's a very simple exercise I like to just have people start to do so that they can get comfortable in calling out their losses and giving themselves permission to grieve and then beginning to let go.
Thank you. Gabby, I'm so glad you're back. And I want to focus a few questions on you before we turn to the audience. But you speak to a lot of people because you edit all these stories of grief and loss in all different ways, not just the loss of a loved one, but these losses of security and of certainty, of dreams, of plans. And you've heard almost everything. What do you tell someone in this moment who's feeling tremendous grief but can't necessarily name it or place it on one thing? They just feel an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss.
I mean, I think it's, as Kate was saying, it's really, and she was talking about children, but I think with young adults and elders and everyone, I think it's just so important to name what we're going through. I think we're in this moment where like everyone in the universe feels like they have a stake in this grief that we're or maybe not the universe, but certainly this planet, they can lay claim to this loss that everybody is feeling. And they're feeling symptoms that are very characteristic of grief, feeling that like clear before and after, feeling more distracted, perhaps tired, angry, nostalgic. I just think it's so important to remember that as we grieve this communal loss, it's okay for people to feel it as their own very personal loss, because it is. Each and every loss is a loss of a person, is a loss of a world. And no one wants their loved one's life and what they lived and did and who they were to be overshadowed and remembered just by the global scope of this tragedy. We have to remember that, you know, here in America, it's 40,000 personal tragedies. It's okay to feel what you're feeling and not, and want it to be your own. As one of we had a recent piece on modern loss published yesterday, and she was saying coronavirus, you know, if you lost someone recently, or if you lost someone years ago, it reminds you who's in your inner ring and inner circle and who isn't. And it can be a real trigger for losses past, as well as, you know, losses due to COVID or losses just due to, you know, natural causes or many other causes that happen now. And yet we can't rely on the same kinds of rituals and support networks we otherwise would. We can't be together.
I want to go there in a second, but you touched upon something, this idea of compounded loss, and Kate mentioned it as well, where it triggers another loss, right? That maybe you haven't had the time to grieve, and it may be, and so it's loss upon loss. Can you speak about compounded losses and how we navigate them? Because they can feel pretty heavy, like they can feel like luggage you just don't want to carry. And the other thing about that is like, how long are we supposed to grieve for, right? Is there a statute of limitations to this?
I mean, I'd say to that, definitely not. There's no statute of limitations, and there aren't 5 stages. There are hundreds, and we, you know, and they're not linear, and we go from here to there, and then back again, and then forward. So certainly there's no timeline. Certainly there's no linear nature to what we're going through. And regarding loss on top of a loss, I feel like people are you know, they've lost their loved ones, perhaps to this, perhaps to something else, perhaps recently, and they have lost not just their person and the world that person, you know, meant to them. They lost the ability to mourn in the way that they had imagined. You know, if this wasn't a sudden death, imagine mourning with friends around them, with clergy around them, handing, you know, if they're Jewish and they're handing the shovel from person to person, they can no longer do that. There's so, they cannot be in a actual, if, again, in the Jewish tradition, a minyan of 10 people. praying and saying the mourner's Kaddish. There are so many losses. We have a whole chapter in our book about collateral damage, like all the things that and this was well before COVID. This was published 2 years ago. All the things that happen after, like this too. Like, I can't believe that I just lost my person and now this, really, world, like, give me a break. But I think people are feeling a lot of that now because what they had imagined relying on in such a sad and intense period is not available to them in precisely or in that IRL, in real life way that they're used to.
I was going to say, I think it should be a hashtag this too, because as a rabbi, not being able to be with people in their grief, not being able to stand with them at the graveside, not being able to explain the chesed shelamet, which you referred to, this act of generosity where you hand the shovel and let them put the dirt in the grave, not being in those pivotal moments, we're trying to create them, right, through Zoom and through other methodologies, which is creating a different level of intimacy, but acknowledging that it's not the same. It's just not the same.
And I really think we should, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
No, I was just going to add on to your thoughts, Gabby, because I think one of the things that is very similar in modern loss and Kate's Club, even though they are, kind of have two different, they serve two different populations, is that the power of story. We have got to, this is an opportunity to elevate the value of sharing your story around your unique loss. I mean, personally, my life changed completely. I was 19 years old. My mother had died 7 years ago. Everybody around me was saying that I should be over it, that, I should be whole again, whatever that meant. And I was asked to share my story in front of a group of children. And, it just kind of fell upon me, which is a beautiful thing. So I shared my story for the first time. And that was the moment that I was introduced to not only how freeing and healing it was for me to verbalize it, to actually share to have identity around my loss, but it then connected me to a whole community of people who could then be inspired and find their identity, but share that back. That is what is so powerful in all of this. Yes, the rituals, there are a lot that have gone away, but what I would love to see is we give so much value to, posting about our joys and our wins and everything that's great in our life, right? Like, this is a moment to really recognize that the value of loss and of grief is as human as the joy, and it needs to be elevated to carry that priority and that importance.
Kate, I love that you said that, because I think we should be talking about grief in the way you're suggesting, and people are now asking a lot of questions, and I want to turn to that. So for those of you that are just joining us and those of you that are asking questions, I wish I could get to every single one. We have hundreds, but I will do my best to pick out some that I think will all resonate for. Again, I'm with Gabrielle Birkner of Modern Loss and Kate Atwood of Kate's Club. And I have to say, Kate, when you shared that story about sharing with others, it's a very Jewish story. So you might have been Jewish in another life. But I'm hearing this a lot from a number of people, and that they're experiencing a loss with their teenagers. They're retreating. They're refusing to participate in family life. They're not leaving their room. And can you speak to the types of loss that adolescents are feeling? We talked a little bit about small children. We talked about adults. What are these losses for teens that are sort of really isolating, and how that's going to affect them possibly later or now?
Well, part of it is, they are in a high developmental stage of growth, of relationship, and I can even add on hormonally too, right? So loss of connection hits that group probably the hardest, especially in, a time in the world where, connection is such a given. They've gone from having on demand, connection in their everyday lives to suddenly that being, taken away. So I think, again, for them, not being able to be around their peers in an environment where they're able to kind of feel out, all the things that are developing in their lives, whether it's a crush and they have butterflies, or, it's, finding, who their good friends are, and the laughter and the humor that comes from that. They're also at an age where emotionally they are very attuned to the loss on a bigger scale. And if it is their first loss, if there's kind of their first, puncture of innocence, or a first major change in their life, then they're at a door of, having to go through that they just may not have the tools around, right? This isn't something we teach in school. This isn't something certainly that we prepare our kids for, because why would you? You don't want to have to prepare your kids. But to understand that they're already in such an intense time of growth and a pace that really is unique to their age group, that their loss and their grief can be intense as well.
I imagine a curriculum like we get under the table for an earthquake in Los Angeles. I imagine a curriculum post-COVID, which is like, how do we deal with not being socially connected, and especially at an age where we depend on it so greatly. Let me, Gabby, turn to you for a second. There's a lot of fear that this is permanent, that this will have lasting changes, and these losses will have a lasting permanent effect on us. How do you respond to that? And what do you say to someone? Because once you've had loss, you can't undo it. So how do you move forward, or how do you get into a growth mindset about that?
Yeah, I think that when you're feeling intense grief, and when I cut out earlier, I was talking about the difference between grief, grieving, and living with loss. And when you're grieving, you feel like it will never end. And I feel like a lot of people right now are probably sensing that, that when will this end? They don't know. It feels indefinite, and that they feel that their lives will be forever changed. And some things certainly will, and some things will not. But I think it's a matter of trying to your question was like, how do you
get out of that mindset of like, what if this is permanent? Meaning, I experienced these losses, and what if this has forever changed me? Yeah. And I imagine both you and I have lost our parents. Both you and I understand that it does forever change you. So what do you do with that information?
Yeah, and I think this will change people personally, individually, and I think it will change society in ways, that might, that are not good. Clearly, we're feeling the effects of that now. And then there are like many silver linings of I find that in Jewish tradition, and just seeing people on Facebook coming up with ways to mourn and to gather and to tell their stories and bear witness to other people's stories in ways that they hadn't previously considered. So I think that, so much of, we don't know how long this is going on. We don't know in which ways our society will be changed, but I feel like there will be more conversation about loss and what it means, and like living with a real empathetic love. And I think there will be innovation in how we reach out to people, as Kate mentioned earlier, connection and growth. I feel like that is something that's, I don't know, permanent, but I think it's going to be with us for a long time. We're figuring out ways to talk about this here right now, that there on a platform that, maybe didn't exist a couple months ago. And we're really figuring out ways to be innovative and to show up and to follow up and to follow through for the people that we love and who need us at this really challenging moment.
I also heard in that it's going to take some courage and innovation, right? That it's going to say, I got to do this differently, and I've got to reach out for help. And maybe in the past, I would disconnect or I would isolate you're saying actually bear witness, not just for yourself, but for other people, right? They need to hear your story. And it's almost like a mitzvah. It's a good deed to be sharing your story. And I hear that, Kate, that was the first story that enabled you to really begin this process of growth.
Yeah, and as somebody that has had a lifetime of living with loss, I love how Gabby says that. There are great gifts. There are great gifts that come from grief, but you have to be willing to face it. You have to be willing to go through it. And our old patterns of trying to avoid it, trying to diminish it, maybe trying to tuck it away, that is what we have to change. If we don't want to feel this heavy, if we don't want to feel that infinite, pain and sorrow, it's like everything. It requires, while grief is a state of being, it's an emotional experience. It requires, pathways. It requires action and communication and connection. And what I hope from all of this is that we can set a new tone that is empowering around facing grief. I didn't say it's easy or it's comfortable, but it can be empowering, and it very much can be transformative.
Well, I love that you say being courageous is finding comfort in the discomfort. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that you're going to be like, yay, grief, right? It's the opposite. It's, I will face this if I can bear witness to it and sit in the discomfort. We have time for one more question. And a lot of questions I think are really relevant for this time is people's marriages are ending. Coworkers are being fired because of financial losses to the company. People are asking in many different ways, how do I talk about loss with people who've lost their job, or people that are getting a divorce, or people that are experiencing a loss from the death of a loved one? What do I say to them? And how can I be comforting without being pedantic or something else? So Gabby, maybe you can answer what are the words we say? And certainly it's not time heals, because the next person that said that to me when my parents died, I was ready to
Yeah, I know. People say a lot of insensitive things, and totally not out of malice, but because it's really hard to know what to say. I can't really speak to job loss or relationship breakups, though I'm sure there's a lot of overlap. But one thing that sticks with me is that during a Shiva, the tradition is that you go into someone's house and you don't say you are silent until the mourner speaks, because your presence bears witness. So in lieu of being able to be present in the physical sense of the word, it's about trying to figure out, how can I be present and really listen and let the mourner lead with what they're feeling, and mirror their thoughts and their emotions, and let them share their needs. So figuring out how our tradition and our just society demands of us to figure out what we are called upon to do, which is to comfort the mourner. I think there's no one phrase that's going to comfort everyone who's going through loss, but really that continuous presence and figuring out how to be present even in your absence.
So the gift is presence that you give other people. Kate, the other great gift that comes from this moment of grief?
I think the gifts that come from growing through grief are, we are able to see other people suffering. Our eyes are open. If we are held on to denial and shame and blame, we aren't able to exercise compassion. We aren't able to grow to be empathetic human beings, to what Gabby said. I also think there's, even tangible things. There's great creativity. There's great relationships. There is a higher standard of happiness, a higher standard of joy that comes out of allowing yourselves to be in the depths of sorrow and sadness. And it's really hard to see when you're in the throes of grief. So I don't throw that out there and that it's going to happen overnight. But I throw it out as, you know, again, the value of the grieving experience and the reward that is waiting from all of us just talking about this and bringing it to the surface.
I wish everybody that's on today could share this webinar with a friend, because the volume of comments that we've gotten just about you naming it and about normalizing it and also being a witness to it is a gift that you both have given us today. I hope that today you had a chance to normalize your grief, to name your grief, and to recognize that we are truly in this together. I hope that you'll join us for more Biyachad offerings. This week we have Alicia Reiner from Orange is the New Black and her husband talking about relationship in very tight spaces. Ronan Bergman with our president, Jeff Herbst, talking about the current situation in Israel. We offer all kinds of different opportunities for learning. And so mostly I want to thank the two of you, not only for coming on today, but also for sharing your wisdom and for doing God's work in the world, because naming people's suffering, giving them space to feel it, enabling each one of us to walk more bravely in the world is really God's work. And I thank you both so much. I hope that you'll come back to AJU many times again and again. And I hope that you'll check out Modern Loss, Kate's Club, and the American Jewish University for all kinds of learning and wisdom in the future. Thank you so much to all of you for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For having me.